The neighbors remember it well. A wiry little boy in the back lot, barefoot in the heat, kicking a sun-bleached mattress tied to a fence until the springs rattled. No coach shouted orders. No father barked corrections. It wasn't training in the way anyone understood. It was imitation, obsession. He'd seen a grainy video clip once. A fighter walking out slow motion, veins like rope, the crowd's roar rolling over him like a wave. Something in that moment convinced the boy, that's what I'm meant to do. He came from a family that measured every coin twice. In their rural town, sports weren't careers. They were luxuries. His mother worried about bruises, his father said nothing, and siblings watched with half-amused disbelief. The mattress was all he could afford, and the backyard became his gym. The sun baked the ground, the air carried the dry tang of dust. Roosters crowed somewhere beyond the fence. Neighbors peeked over, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. The first kick stung, toes screaming, ankle jolted, but the hollow thump against the mattress was intoxicating. He had no idea his form was wrong, no sense of timing or guard. There was no right way for him yet, only the way it felt in his head. In that small space between kicks, he wasn't a poor kid in a forgotten street. He was already walking into the lights. And yet, this was not where his real training began. That moment would come later, when a doorway into a real gym cracked open. A place that would strip away illusions, along with the skin on his shins. The first thing anyone noticed was the smell. Tiger balm, sweat, and old rope, heavy in the air like a second skin. The boy stood just inside the doorway, bare feet on the cracked cement, watching the storm unfold. Pads slammed, heavy bags swung like pendulums. Coaches barked in a language of short, sharp commands. At the center was his first trainer, a compact man carved out of wire and iron, voice clipped and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't explain. He demonstrated once, then expected perfection. A mistake was met with a flat glare, sometimes a sharp slap to the shoulder. Praise didn't exist here, only the absence of correction. That first day was a shock to the system. 5 kilometers on blistered feet, push-ups on knuckles until the skin split, knees on the bag until the hips seized up. The boy's breath came in ragged bursts, chest burning, vision tunneling. Around him, older fighters moved with surgical precision, breathing like machines, landing kicks that cracked like split bamboo. Drops of sweat fell to the floor in steady patterns, tiny constellations in the harsh light. The room wasn't just a gym. It was a living hierarchy. Some older fighters offered a quick nod, a tip about footwork. Others looked straight through him, measuring him as a threat they might face one day. It was part school, part battlefield. This was nothing like the slow-motion highlight reels he'd imagined. Here, the glamour was stripped away, replaced by drills that broke the body before they built it. It was the first real lesson. Fighting wasn't about looking sharp. It was about surviving the grind. He didn't know it yet, but this was the doorway to the ring, to the chaos that waited beyond the ropes. And that chaos would call his name sooner than he thought. The crowd roared as the kick landed, a sharp crack against ribs that echoed through the humid night. For a heartbeat, the boy stood frozen, not in fear, but in awe. That sound, that cheer, was everything he didn't know he was chasing. Hours earlier, the place had been a chaos of smells and noise. A makeshift ring sat beneath strung-up lights at the edge of a temple fair. The ropes were frayed, the canvas stained from years of forgotten bouts. Vendors grilled skewers nearby, the smoke curling into the heavy air. Incense drifted from the temple steps, clashing with the buttery scent of popcorn. Loud music blared and cut out in uneven bursts as the announcer bellowed names into a distorted microphone. His opponent was just a boy too, but built like a statue. Calf muscles coiled tight, eyes locked and unblinking. He didn't smile during the face-off. He didn't need to. That look, steady, already certain, said he'd been here before. When the bell rang for round 1, the pace was cautious, circling, feints, testing the distance. Round 2, the statue came alive, heavy kicks closing the gap, forcing the newcomer to the ropes. The air rang with each impact. Then round 3, the spark, a counter body kick that landed clean. The crowd's cheer hit harder than the strike itself, jolting the boy forward. But the moment didn't last. The pressure came back. The points slipped away. When it was over, the referee raised the other boy's hand. Family in the stands wore mixed faces. A mother biting her lip, a father nodding once, friends laughing too loud to hide their respect. The trainer didn't smile, didn't frown, just said, "Good, keep training." The boy left the ring not as a winner, but as something else, a fighter who had heard the crowd once and now couldn't imagine silence. And that need more than the sting of defeat, would pull him toward the grind that waited beyond tomorrow's dawn. The bell had rung hours ago, the crowd long gone, but the fighter was still limping through the market, a plastic bag of instant noodles swinging in one hand. Tomorrow the schedule wouldn't change. It never did. From the outside, his life looked like a ritual carved into stone. Mornings began in the dark with a 7 to 10 kilometer run through half-lit streets or dusty village roads, sweat pooling before the sun even rose. Breakfast was white rice, boiled eggs, maybe a scrap of chicken on good days. By 9 o'clock a.m., the air in the gym was already thick with heat as he pounded the heavy bag, traded pad work with partners, and drilled techniques until his muscles screamed. Afternoons were another battle. 2 to 4 o'clock p.m. was reserved for pad rounds, clinch work, and sparring that left wrists taped and ribs sore. A short run or jump rope session followed at 5 o'clock p.m. And by nightfall, he was icing knees and ankles while the rest of the world was having dinner with family. On paper, he fought 12 to 15 times a year. A win might bring in 3,000 baht, about $90. But after the 30% cut to his trainer and gym, the rest barely lasted a week. Rent for a shared room with 2 other fighters, basic food, protein powder, hand wraps, gloves, fight shorts, massage balm. Every coin had a purpose. The venues were small, often makeshift rings in night markets or temple fairs. The audience a mix of locals and wandering tourists. Referees were sometimes retired fighters wearing jeans instead of uniforms. Opponents could be swapped last minute, weight classes ignored entirely. This life demanded sacrifice in quiet, cruel ways. He missed his mother's birthday 3 years in a row, skipped a best friend's wedding. Lunar New Year meant nothing but another day of training. The calendar was owned not by him, but by the fight schedule, and still, he showed up, bruised, hungry, and certain that somewhere down the road, all this grind would lead to the night when his name would be called under the bright lights. The decision had already been made before he even laced his gloves, his name quietly erased from the fight poster, replaced by a grinning foreigner with twice the Instagram followers and half the skill. The replacement would walk into the spotlight, pose for photos, and collect a paycheck big enough to pay rent for months. He would stay in the shadows, training as if the call might still come, though he knew it wouldn't. It wasn't the first time. Promoters had their own way of measuring worth, and it had little to do with clean technique or hard-earned records. They wanted stories that sold tickets, the trash talker who picked feuds online, the fighter with a sob story ready for the cameras, the kid who could sell merch as easily as he could throw a jab. Skill was negotiable, marketability was not. He'd seen it in other sports too, but it stung worse here. Watching a flashy MMA rookie, average at best, ride a wave of podcast appearances and viral clips straight into a sponsorship deal. This fighter had been knocked out in the first round at small shows, yet somehow ended up under arena lights, smiling next to executives in tailored suits. Meanwhile, the quiet ones, the grinders, the gym rats, stayed stuck in sidecards at local fairs. He'd been in this game long enough to know the difference between a good fighter and a famous one. The good fighter fought with strategy, discipline, and precision. The famous one fought with a narrative, a brand, and a manager who could spin even a mediocre performance into a headline. The unfairness was almost mathematical. A mediocre fighter with 200,000 followers earned 10 times the purse of a seasoned technician with none, and yet the system was too old, too entrenched to fight against from the bottom. He could rage about it in private, but in public he bowed, smiled, and kept training. That was the part no one saw. The quiet surrender to an ecosystem that didn't care who could fight, only who could trend. And as the next fight card was announced without his name, he told himself it didn't matter, but it did. And that truth would follow him into the next round of his career, one where the body, not just the system, began turning against him. He woke to find his knee twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and warm under his hand. The fight was 3 days away, but the decision was already made for him. He wouldn't be stepping into the ring. Somewhere across town, his replacement was lacing up gloves, taking the slot he'd spent weeks preparing for. Years earlier, a night like this would have been followed by a full recovery after a day's rest. Now, the swelling lingered for weeks. The ache in his hip hummed through every step, and twisting his torso felt like grinding gears with no oil. Friends still saw the fighter, the posture, the walk. But up close, he carried a pharmacy in his gym bag. Knee sleeves, wrist wraps, painkillers, a jar of balm for every joint. Living with injury had its rituals. Nights out were replaced by ice baths. Dinner meant propping a cushion between his knees to ease the pressure. Even sleep wasn't rest. It was a careful balancing act between pain and position. The comparison to his younger self was cruel. Back then his body was all clean lines and quick reflexes, the kind that could turn a missed kick into a spinning elbow without thinking. Now, scars mapped across his shins, joints clicked like old doors, and every bruise overstayed its welcome. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. It was the creeping thought, if I can't fight, who am I? Retirement wasn't just the loss of a paycheck. It was the loss of identity. He'd built his entire existence around the ring. Without it, he wasn't sure what was left. For now he kept moving, training in bursts, telling himself the body still had a few good rounds left. But even as he taped his wrists for the next session, the question lingered. Not if the end was coming, but when. The referee raised his hand. The crowd clapped politely, a few voices cheered, and somewhere in the corner, his coach nodded once. It was a win. Clean, by decision. The kind of result that should have meant something. But as the adrenaline faded, so did the illusion. No cameras closed in. No contracts slid across a table. The ring crew was already dismantling the ropes before he'd even taken off his gloves. Weeks earlier, the comeback had felt like a mission. The diet was ruthless. No fried food, no sugar, more greens and lean meat than he thought he could stomach. Training doubled, strength work in the mornings, technical sparring in the afternoons. Even his social media came alive with clips of bag work, weigh-ins, and short interviews on small fight channels. His coach pushed harder than ever, telling him this was the chance to prove he still belonged. Teammates played their part, standing in as sparring partners, replicating the style of his opponent, urging him to go one more round. On fight night, the strategy was sharp. He kept the distance early, working teeps to manage space, then clinched to sap the other man's strength. In the final round, he pressed forward. Elbows, knees, enough volume to control the pace. By the bell, he knew he'd done enough to win. But the opponent was a no-name. The fight lacked a highlight moment, and the decision, though clear, offered nothing to sell. No viral clips, no post-fight interviews, no calls from bigger promotions. Within days, it was as if the fight had never happened. Pride in the performance gave way to a hollow ache. He had poured months of work, discipline, and sacrifice into a night that changed nothing. Back in the gym, the bag still swung the same, the sweat still stung the same, and the silence after training felt heavier than ever. The win was real, but so was the truth. In this game, effort wasn't currency, and victory didn't always buy a future. The next step was no longer about proving he could fight, but figuring out why he still was. The boy's kick landed with a crisp thwack against the pads, just the way he'd been shown. The coach, once a fighter feared for his elbows, let the hint of a smile flicker across his face. It wasn't his victory, but it felt close enough. Months earlier, the boy had walked into the gym wearing borrowed gloves 2 sizes too big, his frame all knees and elbows, his stance awkward. He had no rhythm, no footwork, only a stubborn light in his eyes. The coach saw something there. Not greatness promised, but greatness possible. He kept him close, correcting angles, teaching how to own the space inside the ropes. The shift from fighter to trainer hadn't been smooth. In the ring, every decision had been his own, every risk calculated for himself. Now he stood outside the ropes, shouting instructions he couldn't execute, watching openings he couldn't take. At first it felt like being locked out of a fight he knew he could win, but over time there was a quiet satisfaction. Every sharp jab his student landed, every clinch escape done right, was a small echo of his own past skill. The focus shifted, no longer about personal glory, but about building someone else's. The pressure was different too. In the corner, you weren't fighting just for a win, but to keep someone safe, to keep them believing. Victories brought pride, not for the trophy, but for the proof that the work mattered. Losses cut deep, almost as deep as his own once had, but he learned to mask it, to offer steady words instead of frustration. And yet, standing there with the pads in his hands, he couldn't shake one truth. This was still a fight, just one fought through someone else's gloves. He didn't know if that would ever be enough, but for now, it was the only way to stay close to the ring without stepping back inside. The ring was empty, but the lights were still on. A single rope swayed gently, creaking against its post as if remembering the weight of a fight. He stopped in the doorway, the scent of leather and liniment pulling him back to nights when his body was sharp, his lungs full, and the bell meant everything. Years of fighting had left him with more scars than trophies, but also with a truth he hadn't understood when he started. Persistence could take a man further than raw talent, but knowing when to stop was its own form of victory. Success, he realized, wasn't the belt or the headline. It was still having a place in the gym, still shaping the next pair of hands that would wrap and tighten before a fight. Failure wasn't losing. It was quitting before the fight was truly over. He thought of the young fighters he coached now. The boy who'd shown up with borrowed gloves. The girl who'd stayed late to drill her guard one more time. They were his quiet legacy. No medals on the wall, but dozens of stories, each carrying a piece of what he'd learned and given away. If he could tell them one thing, it would be this. Love the process, not just the win. Have a road waiting for you beyond the ropes, so when the day comes, you can walk it without fear. As he turned to leave, the hum of the lights followed him, a reminder that the ring didn't miss him. It never did. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe the point wasn't to be remembered by the crowd, but to leave something behind in the fighters who would stand here next. And as the door swung shut, he wondered, not for the first time, whether his best fight had already happened or if it was still ahead of him, hidden somewhere he hadn't yet looked.